The lamp oil runs out at the worst possible moment. In the suffocating darkness of the burial chamber, something exhales a sound like wind through a cavern, but wet, deliberate, hungry. Then comes the scraping, stone on stone, movement where nothing should move. Dr. Edward Bancroft's hands shake as he fumbles for matches. The darkness here is absolute in a way that darkness above ground never is. 300 feet of solid limestone separate him from the stars, from the desert night, from anything resembling safety. The air tastes of mineral dust and something older, something that makes his lizard brain scream warnings his conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. When the match flares in his trembling hand, the hieroglyphs seem to writhe in the dancing light. Behind him, carved into the wall with frantic urgency, the warning reads, "Here Ammit feeds. Here the unworthy are unmade. Seal this place forever." The chisel marks are rough, hasty. Whoever carved these words did so in terror, in desperate hope that future generations would heed what their own generation had learned too late. Below the warning, painted in red ochre that still looks disturbingly fresh after 3 millennia, are symbols Bancroft recognizes from the book of the dead protective spells meant to bind, to contain, to prevent passage between worlds. But it is too late for warnings. The scraping sound grows louder, closer. Something heavy drags across stone with the patience of geological time, unhurried because it knows there is nowhere to run. Bancroft's match illuminates perhaps 15 feet of the chamber. Beyond that radius lies darkness so complete it seems textured, almost solid. And in that darkness, something is standing up. The thing that emerges from the deeper chamber is impossible. Its crocodile head swings low on a neck too flexible for reptilian anatomy, jaws parted to reveal rows of teeth meant for more than flesh. These are teeth designed to hold, to prevent escape, to ensure that what enters those jaws can never leave. The snout is massive, prehistoric, scarred with hieroglyphs that seem carved into the creature's actual hide, as if it has been marked by divine hands, branded with purposes and prohibitions. Its lion's mane is matted with something dark that might be ancient blood, or might be shadow itself. The fur moves wrong, rippling against the direction of the match's flame, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Beneath that mane, the creature's shoulders are leonine, powerful, graceful, utterly out of place on this composite form. Muscles shift beneath the dark fur with liquid precision as it advances. The hippopotamus haunches move with terrible, inevitable power as it comes forward into the light. Each footfall sounds like a stone slab dropping onto bedrock, heavy, final, the weight of divine judgment made manifest. The creature's hindquarters are broader than a draft horse, marked with more scars, more hieroglyphs, layers of ancient text carved into living flesh across thousands of years. But it is the eyes that break Bancroft's mind. They should be reptilian, cold, unreadable. Instead, they are forward-facing like a mammal's, like a human's, ancient and knowing and filled with recognition. The creature looks at him, and Bancroft feels something pass through his chest, not pain exactly, but assessment, measurement, the weighing of his worth. It is March 1882, and the British expedition to the Valley of Kings has just broken the seal on a tomb that was never meant to be opened. What they thought was a royal burial chamber was something else entirely, a prison, built to contain what the ancient Egyptians feared most. Not the death of the body, which could be overcome through mummification and ritual. Not even the death of the soul, which could be protected through proper burial and offerings. This prison was built to contain the second death, the final death, the erasure of existence itself. This is the night myth walked again. This is the night doctor. Edward Bancroft learned that 3,000 years of Egyptian fear was not superstition but testimony. This is the night the devourer fed once more. The match burns down to Bancroft's fingers. In the instant before it goes out, the creature's jaws unhinge not horizontally like a crocodile's, but vertically, opening like a wound in space itself. Then darkness returns, and in that darkness comes the wet sound of feeding. This is the story of an expedition that began with ambition and ended with terror. In the spring of 1882, a small team of British archaeologists, led by Dr. Edward Bancroft, ventured into the Valley of Kings with the backing of the British Museum and the blessing of Egyptian authorities. Their goal was simple: locate and excavate undisturbed tombs from the New Kingdom period, particularly those connected to the cult of Osiris and the weighing of souls. Bancroft was 43 years old, a respected Egyptologist who had spent the previous decade cataloguing artifacts in Cairo's growing museums. He had the confidence of a man educated at Oxford, the patronage of wealthy collectors in London, and the unshakable certainty that ancient superstitions would yield to modern scientific inquiry. His expedition consisted of 8 European specialists, translators, surveyors, photographers, a medical doctor and 20 Egyptian workers who knew the valley's treacherous terrain better than any outsider ever could. They arrived in Luxor on February 28, 1882, during the season when the Nile's floods had receded and the desert heat had not yet become unbearable. The Valley of Kings stretched before them, that desolate canyon on the west bank, where pharaohs had been buried for 500 years during Egypt's golden age. It was sacred ground, but it was also picked-over ground. Giovanni Belzoni had mapped most of it decades earlier. Tomb robbers had plundered it for millennia. Bancroft didn't expect to find an intact royal burial. Those were the stuff of fantasy, but perhaps a minor noble's tomb, perhaps some artifacts that had been overlooked, perhaps enough to justify the museum's investment and secure funding for future seasons. What they found instead was a chamber that appeared on no maps, mentioned in no royal records, marked only by warnings in the oldest form of hieroglyphic script, the kind used for curses, for divine pronouncements, for things that must never be forgotten. To understand what Bancroft's team was about to unleash, one must first understand what the ancient Egyptians believed about death. Unlike many ancient civilizations that viewed the afterlife as a shadowy half-existence or eternal darkness, the Egyptians believed in transformation, that death was merely a doorway to eternal life in the field of reeds, a paradise where the blessed would live forever in the presence of the gods. But this eternal life was not guaranteed. It had to be earned. The ancient Egyptians developed one of history's most sophisticated belief systems about death and judgment. At its center stood Ma'at, the concept of truth, justice, and cosmic order. Ma'at was not merely a goddess, but a fundamental principle of the universe, the force that held back chaos, that maintained the boundary between the ordered world and the primordial void. When a soul died, it descended to the Hall of Two Truths, where Anubis, the jackal-headed god, would weigh the deceased's heart against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was lighter than the feather, if the soul had lived in accordance with truth and justice, it could pass into the paradise of the field of reeds. This weighing ceremony was depicted in countless tombs, painted on papyrus scrolls, carved into sarcophagi. The deceased would recite the negative confession, 42 declarations of innocence. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not caused pain. I have not borne false witness. If the heart balanced against the feather, if Ma'at acknowledged the soul as worthy, then eternal life awaited. But if the heart was heavy with sin, weighted down by cruelty, lies, and wickedness, then something else waited in that hall, something that existed solely to unmake those who failed the test. The Egyptians called her Ammit-the-Devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. She was not a god. She was not worshipped. She was feared. Ammit was inevitable punishment made flesh. She consumed not just the body, but the soul itself, erasing the person from existence completely. No afterlife, no rebirth, only absolute annihilation. To the ancient Egyptians, this was the ultimate terror, to be removed from the cosmic order entirely, as if you had never existed at all. Not even memory would remain, not even the possibility of resurrection in some future age. For 3,000 years, she remained where she belonged, in religious texts, in tomb paintings, in the nightmares of the unworthy. Scholars like Bancroft understood her as a metaphor, a symbolic representation of divine justice, a psychological tool the priests used to enforce moral behavior. She was mythology, not history, symbol, not substance. But the expedition of 1882 discovered something the scholars had missed. Ammit was not merely a symbolic representation of divine justice. She was real, and she was still hungry. What Dr. Bancroft and his team uncovered in that sealed chamber was not treasure or royal remains. It was evidence of an ancient containment, a place where something had been locked away with every protective spell the Egyptian priesthood could invoke, behind doors meant to never open, in darkness meant to last forever. They opened those doors anyway. This is the terrifying story of Ammit, the soul devourer. This is the account of what happened when British confidence met Egyptian truth. This is the record of the expedition that learned too late why some myths survive because they are not myths at all. The Valley of Kings sits west of the Nile, a desolate canyon carved by ancient floods and shaped by human ambition into the greatest necropolis the world has ever known. By 1082, it had been picked over by tomb robbers, explored by Napoleon scholars, mapped by Giovanni Battista Belzoni, and catalogued by countless expeditions. Dr. Edward Bancroft believed there was nothing left to find nothing significant anyway. He was wrong. On March 14, 1882, his team's surveyor noticed something odd in the limestone cliff face at the far southern end of the valley, where most expeditions never bothered to look. A subtle difference in the rock color, a vertical seam that ran too straight to be natural. When they cleared away centuries of debris and wind-blown sand, they found a doorway that had been deliberately hidden, sealed not with the usual mortar and stone, but with something else, a black resinous substance covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to pulse with meaning even under the harsh Egyptian sun. The inscription was unusual. Bancroft's translator, a Coptic scholar named Mikhail Golly, spent 3 days studying the hieroglyphs before he would speak of what they said. The symbols were archaic, predating even the Middle Kingdom, written in a style suggesting they were meant not to inform, but to warn. "Here lies that which should not wake," Golly finally translated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sealed by order of Pharaoh, blessed by the priests of Anubis, guardian of the threshold between worlds. Let no man break this seal, lest he invite the servants of Apep into the light." Apep, the great serpent of chaos, the enemy of Ra. In Egyptian cosmology, Apep existed in the darkness beyond creation, constantly trying to devour the sun god during his nightly journey through the underworld. Every dawn was a victory over Apep, every sunset risked eternal night. It was mythology, of course, children's stories. But Golly refused to proceed further, and 3 of the Egyptian workers abandoned the expedition entirely that same evening, leaving their wages uncollected. Bancroft was undeterred. The British Museum's funding depended on discoveries, not superstition. On March 17th, they breached the seal. The black resin cracked like obsidian under their tools, releasing a smell that several men later described as ancient rot and burned honey. The doorway opened not into a burial chamber, as expected, but into a descending corridor that dropped at a steep angle into the bedrock. The walls were covered in reliefs, showing processions of priests carrying something in a great sealed vessel, while above them, carved with disturbing anatomical precision, were creatures that didn't belong in any known Egyptian iconography. They had the bodies of men, but heads that were wrong elongated, eyeless, with mouths that split vertically rather than horizontally, their limbs bent at too many joints. In the reliefs, these creatures were shown being driven into darkness by priests wielding torches and the Ankh-Sea, the symbol of life. But in the final relief, near where the corridor descended beyond the reach of their torchlight, the priests were shown fleeing, and the creatures were following. Bancroft's journal from that day is matter-of-fact, almost aggressively rational. Discovered secondary tomb, possibly dedicatory in nature. Unusual decorative program suggests a patrapaic function, i.e., a tomb designed not to honor the dead, but to contain something. Will require further investigation. That further investigation began at dawn on March 18th. By sunset, 3 men were dead, 2 were missing, and the rest were running for their lives through the Valley of Kings, pursued by things that should not exist. Things that moved like smoke and shadow, that made sounds like breaking bone and tearing silk, that left footprints in the sand with too many toes pointing in too many directions. Things that the ancient Egyptians had very good reasons to keep sealed in the dark. To understand what Bancroft's expedition was about to face, one must first understand the Egyptian concept of judgment after death. Every ancient Egyptian lived with the knowledge that their heart would one day be placed on the scales of Maat. The heart was not merely an organ, it was the seat of thought, memory, emotion, and morality. It was the record of every action taken in life, every word spoken, every choice made. The weighing ceremony, depicted in countless tomb paintings and papyrus scrolls, was the moment of absolute truth. Anubis would place the heart on one side of the scale. On the other side rested a single ostrich feather, the symbol of Maat herself. If the heart balanced, the soul could speak the negative confession 42 declarations of innocence and pass through to eternal life. But if the heart was heavier than the feather, if it sank under the weight of sins committed, then something waited beneath the scales. Ammit-the-Devourer. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, three of the Nile's most feared predators combined into a single entity. She crouched beside the scales in every depiction, waiting with infinite patience. Her role was not punishment, but annihilation. The souls she consumed didn't go to any underworld or hell. They simply ceased to exist. No afterlife, no eternal rest, not even the possibility of resurrection. Just absolute final obliteration. This was the ultimate terror for the ancient Egyptians, far worse than any physical death. They spent lifetimes preparing for the weighing ceremony, commissioning Book of the Dead scrolls with protective spells, having their names carved into stone to ensure remembrance, mummifying their bodies to preserve their physical form for eternity. The entire civilization was organized around the desperate hope of passing through judgment intact. But there was something else in the mythology, something the temple priests knew but rarely depicted. The weighing of the heart didn't just determine individual fates, it maintained cosmic order. Maat was not merely justice but balance itself, the principle that kept chaos at bay, that maintained the boundary between the ordered world and the primordial void. Every heart that balanced reinforced this order. Every heart that was devoured weakened it slightly. And if enough hearts were found wanting, if enough souls failed the test, the boundary could crack, Apep could slip through. Is-fit chaos could bleed into the world of the living. The priests understood this. It's why they created the spells, why they built the tombs, why they performed the rituals with such obsessive precision. They weren't just protecting individual souls. They were protecting reality itself. When Bancroft's team discovered the sealed chamber on March 18th, they found something that suggested the ancient priests had failed at least once. The walls of the corridor were covered in what Mikhail Gali called counter-cosmological inscriptions, hieroglyphs written backward, prayers reversed, images of the weighing ceremony showing the scales not level but tilted, the feather rising while hearts sank like stones. Hundreds of hearts, thousands, all failing judgment simultaneously, and beneath them all, carved with disturbing care into the limestone floor, was Ammit, but not waiting patiently beside the scales as she appeared in proper tomb art. Here she was shown in mid-consumption, her crocodile jaws distended impossibly wide, swallowing not individual hearts, but something larger. A great mass of them, all bound together, all condemned at once. Golly's translation of the final inscription was incomplete. He died before finishing it, his heart giving out, the expedition doctor noted, with no apparent medical cause. But his notes survived, and they read, "In the year of the great dying, when the river ran with blood and the sky wept ash, the hearts of Pharaoh's enemies were weighed and found wanting. So many, too many. The devourer grew fat on souls, and in her feeding she tore open. The rest was lost." But Bancroft's team was about to discover what came after that tear. Ammit crouched beside the scales in every depiction of the judgment scene. Her form was unmistakable, the head of a crocodile, powerful jaws capable of crushing bone, the forequarters and mane of a lion, predator and king, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. the most dangerous animal in Egypt. She was a composite of the three most feared creatures in the Egyptian world, combined into a being whose sole purpose was consumption. But this was not the clean death of a predator hunting prey. Ammit did not simply kill, she unmade. When she consumed a soul, that person was erased from existence. No tomb would shelter them, no spells would protect them, no family would remember them in offerings. They would not exist in the afterlife, nor would they exist in memory. The Egyptians had a word for this final death. They called it the second death, and it was absolute. What made Ammit truly terrifying was not her physical form, but her nature. She was not evil. She was function. She had no malice, no hunger in the human sense, no desire beyond her purpose. She simply was. The crocodile's head represented the primal inevitability of being consumed. The lion's body embodied the inescapable nature of judgment. The hippopotamus hindquarters, those massive, crushing limbs, symbolized the weight of consequence itself. Together, they created something that existed outside the normal order of creation, a being that served Ma'at by removing that which Ma'at rejected. In proper cosmology, Ammit had no cult. No temples were built to her. No prayers were offered in her name. To acknowledge her was to acknowledge the possibility of ultimate failure. The ancient Egyptians instead focused obsessively on passing judgment, on keeping their hearts light, on maintaining the moral order that would let them slip past her forever. She was the thing that waited in silence while every other god received worship and sacrifice. But the inscriptions in Bancroft's tomb told a different story. Here, in this hidden chamber that predated the formal Valley of Kings by perhaps 1,000 years, Ammit had been given what looked disturbingly like reverence, not worship. Exactly, the hieroglyphs were careful about that, but acknowledgement, recognition. The walls showed her not in her usual patient crouch, but in various stages of feeding. In one relief, her jaws distended like a serpent's, swallowing hearts the size of offering jars. In another, her form seemed to ripple and change, growing larger with each consumption. A third showed her standing upright, impossibly, horribly upright on those hippopotamus legs, her shadow falling across a prostrate crowd of condemned souls. The most disturbing image was carved above the entrance to the deepest chamber. Here, Ammit's crocodile head was shown splitting open, not horizontally as a crocodile's jaws should move, but vertically, like a wound in reality itself. And from that opening poured smaller creatures that looked like the eyeless, wrong-jointed beings depicted in the corridor above. The hieroglyphs accompanying this image were fragmentary, but Golly's notes included a partial translation. When the devourer consumes beyond her measure, when too many hearts fail the weighing in a single moment, she becomes a door rather than a guardian. And that which hungers in the outer darkness learns the taste of Ma'at's light. 3 members of Bancroft's expedition saw that final relief by torchlight on the evening of March 18th. 2 of them, surveyor James Wickham and photographer Charles Dumont, would later describe feeling physically ill while viewing it, as though the carved stone itself was wrong somehow, occupying space in a way that hurt to perceive. The third man, Egyptian foreman Ahmed Hassan, refused to translate the remaining hieroglyphs beneath the image. He would only say, repeated several times with increasing urgency, that they should seal the tomb immediately, that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed again. They should have listened to Hassan. By midnight, they understood why. When Bancroft's team finally cleared the entrance on March 18th, they found something unprecedented. The door was not simply sealed, it was locked with a complexity that suggested desperation. 7 different seals covered the surface, each from a different dynasty, each applied by a different priesthood. The hieroglyphs spoke of containment rather than protection. They did not warn grave robbers away. They warned everyone away. The inscriptions read, "Here is kept that which feeds. Here rests the unmaking. Elu."
Kie? Ito. Noma. No.
The expedition's translator, a young Egyptian scholar named Khalil Mansour, became visibly distressed as he read the texts. He told Bancroft these were not standard funerary inscriptions. Into places where something dangerous was deliberately imprisoned. Into quarantine zones, into places where something dangerous was deliberately imprisoned. Bancroft dismissed his concerns. He had permits from the Egyptian government and funding from the British Museum. He had not traveled 4,000 miles to turn back at the threshold. The seals themselves told a story of continuous maintenance across millennia. The oldest, barely visible beneath the others, dated to the first intermediate period, that chaotic era between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, when Egypt fractured into warring states. The priests of Anubis had placed it, their cartouche still faintly visible in the corroded wax. Then came a seal from the Middle Kingdom, applied during the reign of Senusret III. Another from the New Kingdom, placed by priests of Osiris during Ramesses II's long rule. The Ptolemaic period added its own seal when the Greeks ruled Egypt. Even the Roman occupation contributed one, suggesting that whatever lay beyond this door commanded respect across cultural boundaries. But it was the final two seals that troubled Mansour most. One bore Coptic Christian symbols, crosses intertwined with anxes, suggesting it had been placed sometime after Egypt's conversion to Christianity, perhaps in the 4th or 5th century AD. The last seal was the most recent, marked with Arabic script and dated impossibly to 1015, less than 4 centuries ago. The inscription was not in classical Arabic, but in the colloquial Egyptian dialect, suggesting local priests or scholars had maintained this vigil even under Ottoman rule. It read simply, "Still it hungers, still we guard." 14 centuries of continuous monitoring, 14 centuries of different civilizations, different religions, different empires, all agreeing on one thing. Whatever was beyond this door must not be released. Mansour tried one final time to dissuade Bancroft. He explained that in all his years studying Egyptian tombs, he had never encountered a seal that crossed religious boundaries. The ancient Egyptians had worshipped different gods. The Christians who came after them viewed those gods as demons. The Muslims who followed viewed both pantheons as Jahiliya ignorance. Yet all three traditions had contributed to keeping this door sealed. That alone should give them pause. Bancroft's response is recorded in his journal. Mr. Mansour's superstitious nature is understandable given his background, but we are men of science. These seals represent nothing more than layered historical paranoia, each generation adding to the mystique of what was likely a minor tomb of no real significance. The British Museum expects discoveries, not cowardice. The breaking of the seals took 6 hours of careful work. They wanted to preserve each one for cataloging, to study the different techniques and materials used across the centuries. The team photographed each layer as it was removed. Charles Dumont's camera captured the moment Bancroft's chisel finally cracked the last seal, the Arabic one from 1517. In the photograph, you can see Bancroft's face in profile, intent and eager. Behind him, slightly out of focus, Mansour stands with his hands pressed together in what might have been prayer. And beyond them both, barely visible in the shadows at the edge of the frame, Ahmed Hassan has already turned away from the door. He would later say he couldn't bear to watch, that he knew with absolute certainty that they were making a terrible mistake. The door swung open at 6:47 p.m. on March 18th, 1882. The sun was setting over the Valley of Kings. By the time it rose again, 3 men would be dead. The passage beyond the door descended at a steep angle, carved directly into bedrock rather than constructed from blocks. The walls were covered in hieroglyphic texts, but these inscriptions were different from any found in other tombs. They did not glorify a pharaoh or list titles and achievements. They described containment procedures. They detailed the rituals required to keep something locked in eternal darkness. They warned of what would happen if the deeper chambers were ever opened. One passage, translated by Mansour with a trembling voice, read, "She who crouches by the scales has been given flesh. The priests of Thutmose bound her here when she walked among the living. 7 gates hold her, 7 spells bind her. The unworthy called her forth, and the unworthy sealed her away. Iroti wo eroita I oh. Expedition found additional chambers branching off the main corridor, small rooms filled with offering jars, ritual implements, and mummified animals, not cats or ibises, but crocodiles, lions, and hippopotamus calves. Sacrifices to something that embodied all three. The implications were staggering. According to every text on Egyptian mythology, Ammit was not a physical being. She was a spiritual entity, a function of cosmic judgment that existed only in the Juat, the realm of the dead. She had no temples because she could not be worshipped. She had no cult because she could not be summoned. She simply was, eternally present at the scales of Ma'at, waiting to consume the unworthy. But these inscriptions told a different story. They spoke of priests during the reign of Thutmose III, roughly 1043, roughly 1000 forbidden. The texts were fragmentary, deliberately damaged in places as though even recording the events was dangerous. But Mansour pieced together enough to understand the basics. During a period of plague and famine, when hearts were failing judgment in unprecedented numbers, when Ammit was gorged on condemned souls, the priests had tried to, what? Summon her? Control her? The hieroglyphs used a verb that Mansour translated as giving threshold to that which has no threshold. Whatever they had done, it had worked. Ammit had manifested in the physical world. The inscriptions described her appearance in terms that were almost clinical. She moved as smoke moves through water. Where she walked, the ground bore prints of 3 animals. When she opened her jaws, the sound was of bones breaking in 3 places at once. People had seen her. People had fled from her, and she had done what she was designed to do. She had consumed. Not souls in the afterlife, but living people in the mortal world. The texts described entire villages emptied, their inhabitants not killed but erased. No bodies remained. No memories survived. It was as though those people had never existed at all. The priests of Thutmose had spent decades trapping her. The inscriptions detailed the process. 7 rituals performed at 7 locations, each one designed to bind one aspect of her composite form. The crocodile's hunger, the lion's inevitability, the hippopotamus's crushing weight. They had lured her into this tomb with offerings of condemned criminals, souls already marked for her consumption. Then they had sealed her here with every spell they knew, every protective formula they could devise. But the inscriptions made one thing abundantly clear. They had not destroyed her. They had only contained her. And containment was not permanent. The texts described maintenance rituals that had to be performed at regular intervals, offerings made, spells renewed, seals reinforced. The priests had expected this burden to fall on their successors, generation after generation, forever. The last maintenance inscription was dated to the reign of Ramesses VII, around 1070 BCE. Nearly 3,000 years ago. After that, nothing. The rituals had stopped. The offerings had ceased. But the seals had held. Until now. Bancroft, reading over Mansour's translations by torchlight, asked the obvious question. If she's been sealed here for 3 millennia without maintenance, what makes you think she's still alive? Mansour pointed to the offering chambers they had passed. The mummified animals inside were not ancient. The linen wrappings were relatively fresh. The desiccation process was incomplete. These sacrifices had been made within the last few centuries, possibly within the last few decades. Someone had been feeding her. Someone had been keeping her satiated, and Bancroft's expedition had just interrupted the feeding schedule. The Egyptian workers hired for the excavation began to refuse assignments almost immediately. They would work in the outer passages but would not descend deeper into the complex. When pressed for reasons, they spoke of dreams that had begun the night the seal was broken, dreams of being weighed, of failing the test, of jaws closing around them. The foreman, a man named Hassan, who had worked excavations across Egypt for 20 years, told Bancroft something that the British archaeologist recorded in his journal, but clearly did not believe. Hassan said his grandfather had been a guardian of the old knowledge, a keeper of stories that stretched back before the time of Muhammad, before the Greeks and Romans. to the time when the old gods still walked. His grandfather had spoken of a tomb that must never be opened, a prison built in the reign of Thutmose III to contain something that had been released by a ritual gone wrong. According to the story, a priestess attempting to invoke Ammit's presence during a judgment ceremony had succeeded too well. The devourer had manifested physically, had begun consuming the guilty and innocent alike, and had required the combined power of the priesthood to trap in stone. The dreams were consistent across multiple workers, which should have been the first warning. Ahmed, the chief water carrier, described waking each morning with the sensation of his chest being opened, of hands reaching inside to remove his heart. His wife reported that he would scream in his sleep, always the same phrase, "It's too heavy, it's too heavy." A stonemason named Youssef told Khalil Mansour that he dreamed of standing in a great hall with scales that stretched to the ceiling, and on one side of the scales was a feather made of light, and on the other side were hearts, not one heart, but hundreds, thousands, all piled together and still sinking, pulling the scales down despite their combined weight. And beneath the scales, waiting with infinite patience, was something with jaws that opened vertically instead of horizontally. Hassan's grandfather's story had more detail than Bancroft's journal fully captured. Mansour, who spoke at length with Hassan and recorded his own notes, preserved the fuller account. According to the oral tradition Hassan's family had maintained, the priestess in question had been named Nebuchadnezzar, and she had served in the mortuary temple of Thutmose III during the final years of his reign. She had been attempting to perform what the old texts called the Great Weighing, a mass judgment ceremony for soldiers who had died in Thutmose's Syrian campaigns. Hundreds of men, all killed in battle far from Egypt, their bodies unable to be properly prepared for burial. The ceremony was meant to judge them collectively, to grant them passage to the afterlife despite the irregularity of their deaths. But something had gone wrong. Whether Nebuchadnezzar had made an error in the ritual, or whether the sheer number of souls being judged at once had drawn too much attention, or whether, as Hassan's grandfather believed, some of those soldiers' hearts were simply too heavy with the weight of what they had done in war, the result was catastrophic. Ammit had appeared not as the patient guardian of cosmic order, but as something older, something hungrier. She had consumed not just the condemned, but some of the priests as well, and in her feeding frenzy, she had torn a hole between the world of the living and the realm of judgment. It had taken 93 priests working in concert to bind her. They couldn't kill her, she was eternal, a fundamental principle of the universe given form. They could only trap her, seal her in stone, and guard that seal for all time. The priesthood had built the hidden tomb specifically for this purpose, carving it deep into the Valley of Kings where the weight of royal judgment might help contain what they had imprisoned. Hassan told Bancroft all of this on March 19th, the morning after the seal was broken. Bancroft's journal entry reads, "Hassan continues to insist on the literal truth of his folk tales. I have assured him that while such stories have anthropological interest, they bear no relation to our scientific work. He has threatened to withdraw his workers. I have threatened to withhold payment. We have reached an impasse." That impasse would be resolved by sunset, but not in any way Bancroft could have anticipated. Strange occurrences began on March 21st, 3 days after the initial seal was broken. Dr. Bancroft's assistant, a meticulous man named Thomas Whitmore, began having difficulty sleeping. He reported dreams of standing in a vast hall with walls of gold and lapis lazuli, watching his own heart being placed on scales. Every night, the feather side of the scales rose higher, while his heart sank lower. On the 4th night, he woke screaming that something with terrible jaws had begun to approach him. The next morning, Whitmore refused to enter the tomb complex. He claimed he could hear breathing coming from the deepest chambers, a wet, patient sound like something large waiting just beyond the light. Other members of the expedition began reporting similar experiences, a sense of being watched, of being evaluated, of being found wanting. The expedition's photographer, David Harrow, captured an image of the main corridor that showed something unusual in the background darkness. When the plate was developed, A shape could be seen that resembled no human form. It appeared quadrupedal but massive, with a head profile that suggested powerful jaws held partially open. Bancroft attempted to rationalize the photograph. He suggested it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by their equipment, perhaps a reflection in the lens. But Harrow was a professional photographer who had documented excavations across the Mediterranean. He had photographed the Acropolis, the Forum, the tombs at Mycenae. He knew shadows, he knew lens artifacts, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that what appeared in his photograph had not been present when he took the image. The shape stood when no one had been standing. It occupied space at a depth in the corridor where his focus should have rendered everything sharp and clear. Yet the figure, if it was a figure, seemed to blur at the edges, as though it existed slightly out of phase with the surrounding stone. More photographs followed over the next 2 days, each one captured by different expedition members using different cameras. Each one showed shapes in the background that shouldn't have been there. In one image taken by surveyor James Wickham of the innermost chamber, something crouched in the corner that had the unmistakable profile of a crocodile's head attached to a body far too large. In another, captured by Charles Dumont while photographing hieroglyphs, a mass of darkness in the corridor behind him seemed to have a mane, or something that caught the light like a lion's fur. Though no living thing had been present when the photograph was taken, the physical symptoms began shortly after. Whitmore complained of chest pains, a heaviness, he said, as though something was pressing down on his sternum. The expedition doctor, Malcolm Ashford, examined him thoroughly and found nothing wrong. His heart sounded normal. His lungs were clear. Yet Whitmore insisted the pressure was increasing daily. He began to walk with a slight forward hunch, as though literally bowed under an invisible weight. Others reported different afflictions. Harrow developed a persistent cough that Ashford attributed to the tomb's dust, except that the cough came in rhythmic patterns, 3 short sounds, then a pause, then 3 more, like something counting. Wickham found that his shadow sometimes moved incorrectly, lagging behind his movements by a fraction of a second, enough to be noticeable in peripheral vision but never when he looked directly at it. Ahmed Hassan, who had been forced by financial necessity to remain with the expedition despite his warnings, reported that he could smell something in the deepest chambers that no one else could detect, a scent like honey and copper, and something older, something that made his stomach turn. Bancroft recorded all of these incidents in his journal with growing irritation. His entries from March 23rd read, "The men are exhibiting symptoms of mass hysteria. Whitmore's chest pains are psychosomatic. Harrow's cough is respiratory irritation. Wickham's shadow observations are tricks of inconsistent lighting. Hassan's olfactory hallucinations are suggestive of his predisposition towards superstition. I have explained repeatedly that there is nothing in this tomb beyond ancient stone and dust." They refused to listen to reason. That same evening, Khalil Mansour discovered something that suggested Bancroft was catastrophically wrong. Hidden beneath a layer of limestone dust in the final chamber was an inscription that changed everything. It read, "The Devourer does not sleep. The Devourer does not rest. The Devourer waits and weighs, and when the scales tip, she feeds." Below that text was a date, carved with urgent rough strokes that suggested haste, year 54 of Thutmose III. The binding weakens. It is hungry. It is always hungry. On March 25th, the expedition reached the final barrier, a door of solid granite covered entirely in protective spells and bound with golden wire inscribed with more warnings. This was the 7th seal, the last line of containment. Mansour, the translator, begged Bancroft to stop. He had been researching the inscriptions in local archives and had found references to this exact location in documents from the reign of Thutmose III. The tomb was listed not as a royal burial but as a Keter Letter 1E25A, a term that translated roughly to sealed danger or permanent containment. The documents described a creature that had manifested during the reign of Amenhotep II, when a high priest attempted to physically invoke Ammit to punish criminals. The manifestation had been successful but uncontrollable. Ammit had begun judging on her own, weighing hearts without waiting for death, consuming those she deemed unworthy while they still lived. It took the combined efforts of 3 temple priesthoods to trap her, and the ritual had required 7 human sacrifices to create the binding. Bancroft dismissed this as superstition colored by later religious fears. He ordered the seal broken. The golden wire that bound the granite door was no ordinary metalwork. Mansour had examined it closely over the previous day, and what he found disturbed him profoundly. The wire was inscribed with protective formulae from the Book of the Dead, specifically the spells meant to shield the deceased during the weighing ceremony, spell 30B, which prevented the heart from testifying against its owner, and spell 125, the negative confession itself. But these spells were written backward, inverted, as though the door wasn't meant to protect what lay beyond it, but to protect everything outside from what was contained within. More troubling still were the 7 small niches carved into the granite surrounding the door. Each niche contained human remains, not full burials, but deliberate deposits. A heart preserved in a canopic jar in the first niche, a tongue in the second, eyes in the third. The fourth contained hands arranged in a gesture of supplication. The fifth held a pair of lungs. The sixth contained a liver. The 7th niche held a complete human skull, jaw open, facing the door. Mansour recognized the arrangement from fragmentary texts he'd studied in Cairo. This was the 7 Gates ritual, a containment ceremony so ancient and so dangerous that most references to it had been deliberately destroyed by later priesthoods who feared even the knowledge of it might be harmful. The documents Mansour had found in the Cairo archives were more specific than he'd initially told Bancroft. They described the high priest's name, Amenemheb, who had served during the 3rd year of Amenhotep II to reign. According to the records, Amenemheb had been troubled by the increasing corruption among the nobility priests accepting bribes to ensure favorable judgments in the afterlife. Officials committing crimes secure in the knowledge that their wealth could buy them safe passage through the Juat. In his zeal for justice, Amenemheb had attempted what no priest should attempt. He tried to bring Ma'at's judgment into the world of the living. The ritual he performed was meant to be symbolic, a demonstration of divine justice that would frighten the corrupt into righteousness. Instead, he had torn a hole in the boundary between worlds. Ammit had come through, but she had not come alone. The documents described servants of the Devourer, beings without eyes that walked like men but moved like smoke, that touched living flesh and left it cold and grey as though the life had been judged out of it. Bancroft's response to Mansour's increasingly desperate pleas was recorded by James Wickham, who wrote in his personal diary, "Doctor, Bancroft has become fixated on what lies beyond that door. He speaks of making the discovery that will secure his legacy, of finding something that will revolutionize our understanding of ancient Egypt. He will not listen to reason. He will not acknowledge the evidence before his eyes, the photographs, the dreams, the physical symptoms we are all experiencing. This morning, Thomas Whitmore collapsed from the chest pains he's been suffering. Doctor, Ashford says his heart is weakening, though he can find no medical cause. Yet Bancroft presses forward. The breaking of the 7th seal began at noon on March 25th. It took 8 hours of careful work to remove the golden wire without damaging it, to photograph and document each protective spell, to catalogue the contents of the 7 niches. Ahmed Hassan refused to participate and withdrew his remaining workers. Only the European members of the expedition remained, along with Mansour, who stayed not out of scientific curiosity but out of a desperate hope that he might somehow prevent the catastrophe he knew was coming. The granite door was finally cleared of its bindings at 8:17 p.m. The sun had set an hour earlier. The Valley of Kings was in darkness except for the expedition's lanterns. Bancroft placed his hand on the door and pushed. It opened without resistance, as though it had been waiting. From the darkness beyond came a sound that Thomas Whitmore, in his final written statement before his death 2 days later, described as the wet, patient breathing of something that has been hungry for 3,000 years. Beyond the 7th seal lay a chamber, unlike any found in other tombs. It was circular rather than rectangular, with a domed ceiling covered in stars. In the center of the chamber stood a massive set of scales, not carved in relief, but actual bronze scales large enough to hold a human body. One side of the scale held a single white feather, impossibly preserved, still pristine after thousands of years. The other side was empty but stained dark, as if many things had been placed there and removed. The walls showed the judgment scene repeated hundreds of times, but these were not stylized paintings. These were records. Each depiction showed a different person, a different weighing, a different outcome. Those who passed were shown ascending to the realm of Osiris. Those who failed were shown being consumed, and the detail of those images was horrific. Ammit was depicted not as a symbolic presence but as a living creature, anatomically rendered with careful attention to teeth, claws, muscle structure. Her jaws were shown unhinging like a serpent's to accommodate entire bodies. In one image, her stomach bulged with the shapes of the consumed, faces still visible through her translucent flesh, screaming silently in their eternal unmaking. The scale itself defied rational explanation. When expedition photographer David Harrow set up his equipment to document it, he found that the feather side of the balance remained perfectly level, no matter how the tripod shifted or how the floor's subtle slope should have affected it. The feather itself, when Bancroft reached out to touch it against Mansour's shouted warnings, felt impossibly light, yet impossibly solid, as though it had weight and mass, but existed slightly outside the normal physical laws. More disturbing was what happened when Bancroft withdrew his hand. For just a moment, the empty scale pan on the opposite side dipped downward, as though something heavy had been placed there, something invisible. Mansour began translating the hieroglyphs that surrounded each judgment scene. They were not the formal religious texts found in other tombs, but something closer to medical records or legal documents. Each entry included a name, a date, a list of transgressions, and an outcome. Seneb, son of Panhosi, year 4 of Amenhotep II. Crimes, murder of brother, theft of offerings, false testimony. Heart weight, excessive. Judgment, consumed, 8th hour of night, 3rd month of Akit. Below that was a note in different handwriting, more hurried. The devourer fed well. The binding holds, for now. That phrase appeared repeatedly throughout the chamber. The binding holds, for now. As if the scribes recording these judgments knew they were creating something temporary, a solution that might fail. And the dates suggested they were right to worry. The judgments recorded on the walls spanned only 7 years, from year 3 of Amenhotep II to year 10. Then they stopped abruptly. The final entry read, Amenemheb, High Priest of Ptah, year 10 of Amenhotep II. Crimes, hubris, forbidden summoning, breach of cosmic order. Heart weight, immeasurable. He has judged himself. We seal this chamber. We bind what should never have been called. May the 7 hold what one man's pride released. But it was the ceiling that held the chamber's true horror. The stars painted there were not the standard astronomical charts found in royal tombs. These constellations were wrong, twisted versions of familiar patterns, as though someone had painted the night sky while looking at its reflection in dark water. And among the stars were other shapes, creatures, the eyeless, wrong-jointed beings that had appeared in the corridor reliefs. They were shown descending from the darkness between stars, drawn to the chamber of scales like moths to a flame. The hieroglyphs accompanying these images used a term Mansour had never encountered in formal texts, Ab-Kaibit, which he tentatively translated as shadow feeders, or those who eat the essence. Charles Dumont was the first to notice that the stars on the ceiling were moving, not the paint, but something behind or within the paint, shifting position in ways that shouldn't be possible. He called the others' attention to it, and for several minutes, the entire expedition stood in the chamber watching as the constellation patterns slowly rotated, as the creatures painted among them seemed to drift closer, as something that might have been eyes, though they were painted as mere voids, appeared to turn toward the living men below. Thomas Whitmore, already weakened by days of chest pains, collapsed at that moment. His heart had stopped. Dr. Ashford worked frantically to revive him, but even as he performed chest compressions, he noted something impossible. Whitmore's chest was cold to the touch, as though his body heat had been drawn out of him. And the scale in the center of the chamber, the empty pan opposite the white feather, had dipped down significantly, as though a great weight had just been added to it. When they finally got Whitmore's heart beating again, he opened his eyes and screamed. He screamed for 3 full minutes, a sound of such pure terror that Ahmed Hassan, waiting in the outer chambers, would later say he heard it echo through the entire tomb complex. And when Whitmore finally found words, all he could say, repeated over and over, was, "She weighed me. I felt her weigh me. My heart is too heavy. My heart is too heavy." The scale pan remained down. The feather side had risen into the air. Something was being judged. The first attack came at sunset on March 26th. The expedition was preparing to leave for the day when the lamps began to gutter and fail despite fresh oil. The temperature in the chamber dropped so rapidly that breath became visible. Then came the sound, a heavy exhalation from the passage that led deeper into the complex. A passage they had not yet explored because it appeared to dead end in collapsed rubble. But something was moving in that darkness. Something large. Dr. Bancroft ordered everyone to remain calm and stay together. He held his lamp high as the sound grew closer. What emerged from that passage should not have been possible. It moved on 4 legs like a great cat, but the proportions were wrong. Too large, too heavy. The head that swung into the lamplight was the head of a crocodile, but the eyes were forward-facing like a mammal's, ancient and knowing and filled with something that might have been recognition. It looked at each member of the expedition in turn, and several later swore they felt a terrible assessment taking place, as if invisible scales were weighing their worth in that moment. The creature opened its jaws and made a sound that was not a roar or a hiss, but something closer to speech, words in a language no human had spoken for 3,000 years. Khalil Mansur understood enough to translate, though he would later say he wished he hadn't. The words were Old Egyptian, predating even the Middle Kingdom, spoken with a grammatical structure that suggested ritual formulae. Hearts have been weighed, hearts have been found wanting. The devourer feeds. The creature's voice, if it could be called a voice, seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating in the stone itself, vibrating in the bones of everyone present. James Wickham broke first. He ran toward the exit passage, and the creature moved with a speed that defied its massive bulk. One moment it was 20 feet away, the next it was upon him. What happened next was recorded in multiple survivor testimonies, all of which aligned despite the trauma and impossibility of what they witnessed. The creature did not physically attack Wickham. It opened its jaws, those terrible crocodile jaws that unhinged like a serpent's, and something that was not quite breath and not quite smoke poured from its throat. The substance, if it was substance, touched Wickham's chest, and he collapsed instantly, clutching at his heart. Dr. Ashford reached him seconds later, but Wickham was already changing. His skin had taken on a grey pallor, not the grey of death, but something worse, as though the colour was being leached out of him, along with something else. His eyes remained open, aware, terrified. He tried to speak, but no sound came. His chest rose and fell, so he was breathing, but there was no warmth in him. When Ashford checked his pulse, he found it growing fainter with each beat, not as though the heart was stopping, but as though it was becoming less substantial, less real. The creature watched this process with what could only be described as patience. Its leonine body was covered in fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and beneath that fur, muscles moved with a liquid grace that belonged to no earthly anatomy. Its hindquarters, massive, heavy, unmistakably hippopotamus in form, were marked with scars that looked like hieroglyphs carved into flesh, and behind it, emerging from that supposedly collapsed passage, came others. They were smaller, more humanoid, but no less wrong. The AB Kaibit that Mansour had identified in the ceiling paintings. They moved like men, but with joints that bent in too many directions. Their heads were elongated, eyeless, with mouths that split vertically when they opened. And they were opening now, revealing not teeth but something like chambers or furnaces, spaces that seemed impossibly deep, as though the inside of these creatures extended further than their outside forms should allow. Charles Dumont, in an act of either bravery or madness, raised his camera and took a photograph. The flash of the magnesium powder illuminated the entire chamber for one brilliant instant. In that flash, everyone saw what the lamplight had mercifully obscured. There were dozens of the smaller creatures, perhaps hundreds, packed into the passage behind the great beast. They filled the space like a tide held back, waiting. The photograph survived. Dumont did not. The flash seemed to anger or excite the creature's survivor. Testimonies disagree on which. The Abkaibit surged forward, and Dumont was engulfed. Unlike Wickham, who still lay gasping on the floor, Dumont's end was more immediate. The creatures touched him with their elongated fingers, and where they touched, his flesh turned grey and cold. He screamed, but the sound cut off abruptly, as though his voice itself had been consumed. Bancroft, to his credit, finally recognized the magnitude of his error. He ordered an immediate retreat, shouting for everyone to run for the exit. But the great beast Ammit herself, for what else could it be, blocked the main passage. Her forward-facing eyes, so wrong in that reptilian skull, fixed on each fleeing person, and as she looked at them, they felt it, the weighing, the assessment, the judgment. Thomas Whitmore, still weak from his earlier collapse, fell behind. The last thing the survivors heard as they reached the outer chambers was his voice, calling out in old Egyptian words he should not have known, could not have known. I confess my heart. I confess my heart is heavy with, then silence, not even a scream. When Ahmed Hassan and his workers heard the Europeans stumbling from the tomb shouting about monsters and death, Hassan knew his worst fears had been realized. The binding had failed. After 3,000 years, Ammit was free to judge again, and she was hungry. So very terribly hungry. The expedition could not reach the surface before full darkness fell. The passages were treacherous, and in their panic, Whitmore fell and broke his leg. They were forced to take shelter in the Chamber of Scales while the creature stalked the corridors beyond. Throughout the night, they could hear it moving through the complex, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close. It scratched at walls. It tested barriers. It breathed in the darkness just beyond the circle of lamplight. Bancroft's journal from that night still exists, now housed in the British Museum's restricted archives. The entries grow increasingly frantic as the night progresses. He describes how the creature seemed to be searching for something, judging each person not just through sight, but through some deeper sense. Twice it came fully into the chamber, circling the scales, pausing before different members of the expedition, as if considering. Mansour began reciting prayers, not Muslim prayers, but older ones, words in Coptic and ancient Egyptian, fragments of protective spells he had learned from his grandfather. When the creature approached him, it paused, tilted its massive head, and withdrew. But when it approached Whitmore, injured and whimpering in pain, its jaws opened wide, and it began to advance with terrible purpose. Dr. Ashford stepped between them. In his later testimony to British authorities, he would describe the moment with clinical precision despite its impossibility. The creature regarded me for what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps 15 seconds. I felt something pass through me, not physical, not quite mental. It was as though my entire life was being reviewed, every decision weighed, every action measured against some absolute standard. I thought of my work at St. Bartholomew's, the patients I'd saved, the ones I'd lost. I thought of my family, my failures, my small kindnesses, and I felt distinctly a sense of balance. The creature's forward-facing eyes, so wrong in that reptilian skull, narrowed slightly, and it turned away from us both. But it did not leave. Instead, it settled onto its haunches near the bronze scales, massive and patient, watching. The smaller creatures, the Abkaibit, remained in the passages, their eyeless faces occasionally visible at the threshold of the lamplight, their vertical mouths opening and closing soundlessly, as though tasting the air, or perhaps tasting something less tangible. Bancroft's journal entries from the small hours are particularly revealing. At 2:14 a.m. he wrote, "I begin to understand what we have unleashed. This is not a mindless beast. It is a function, a principle given form. It judges because that is what it is. We are being assessed, not randomly, but according to some cosmic calculus we cannot comprehend. At 3:47 a.m., Mansa's prayers seem to hold some power, though he claims they are not prayers but statements, declarations from the negative confession. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not caused pain. He repeats these 42 declarations in rotation, and the creature responds to them. When he speaks truth, it remains calm. Twice now, when his voice has faltered, when he hesitated before declaring, I have not borne false witness, the creature's attention sharpened, and those terrible jaws began to gape. He must maintain absolute honesty. We all must. The expedition members began to understand the rules of their survival. Each person, in turn, began to recite their own confessions. Not the formal negative confession that Mansour knew by heart, but honest accountings of their lives. David Harrow spoke of the photographs he had stolen credit for, of the colleague whose work he had claimed as his own. James Wickham, growing weaker by the hour, his skin still grey from the creature's earlier touch, whispered about the Egyptian antiquities he had smuggled to private collectors, the sites he had looted under cover of legitimate archaeology. Charles Dumont was gone, consumed in the initial attack, but his camera remained, and in it was the photograph he had taken. Ahmed Hassan, who had retrieved some of the expedition's abandoned equipment before fleeing to the outer chambers, brought the camera to the entrance and left it where Bancroft could reach it during a brief moment when the creature withdrew deeper into the complex. The photograph, when they examined it by lamplight, revealed something that made even Bancroft's rationalist certainty crumble completely. In the flash-illuminated image, each person in the chamber cast not one shadow but two. One shadow was normal, falling naturally from the direction of the magnesium flash. But the second shadow for each person extended in the wrong direction, entirely toward the bronze scales in the center of the chamber. And these second shadows had weight. In the photograph, you could see the empty pan of the scale dipping down, burdened by shadows that shouldn't exist. Mansour studied the photograph and spoke in a voice hollow with understanding. We are all being weighed, right now. Every moment we remain in this chamber, our hearts are on those scales. The creature waits to see which way they tip. At 4:23 a.m., Bancroft wrote his final journal entry of that night. Whitmore is dying. His second shadow in the photograph is darker than the rest of ours, heavier, pulling the scale down further. The creature knows this. It watches him with what I can only describe as anticipation. It is waiting for him to fail the test. And when he does, it will feed. God help us, we have opened something that should have remained sealed until the end of the world. Dawn came at 6:14 a.m. on March 27th. The first light of Ra's sun touched the entrance to the tomb complex. The creature's breathing, which had been constant throughout the night, suddenly ceased. There was a moment of profound silence, and then the sound of something massive withdrawing, moving back through the passages toward the chamber of scales and beyond, into those deeper spaces that the expedition had never fully explored. They had survived the night, but Thomas Whitmore's second shadow had grown darker still, and everyone in the chamber knew with terrible certainty that he would not survive another. What happened next is recorded in 3 separate accounts: Bancroft's journal, Mansour's testimony to Egyptian authorities, and a letter written by the expedition's surveyor, James Crawford, to his sister in London. All 3 agree on the essential facts. Whitmore's heart was failing. Whether from fear or injury, he was dying in that chamber. And as death approached, the creature became more focused, more determined. It seemed to know that a soul was about to pass from the living world to the realm of judgment, and it intended to claim that soul according to the old law. Bancroft made a decision. He ordered the expedition to leave Whitmore behind and run for the surface while the creature was distracted. It was the only way the rest would survive. They fled through the passages, their lamps held high, while behind them they heard Whitmore's screams suddenly cut short. The sound that followed was worse, the wet, crushing sound of consumption, and then a silence so complete it felt like erasure itself. When they emerged into the pre-dawn light, They sealed the entrance with whatever stone they could move. Egyptian authorities arrived by noon. A decision was made at the highest levels. The tomb was to be filled with concrete and marked as structurally unsound. No further excavation would be permitted. No one would be allowed to ask what had been found or what had been left behind. The official report listed Whitmore's death as an accident, a rockfall in unstable passages. The truth was classified and buried as deeply as the tomb itself. The three accounts, while agreeing on the basic sequence of events, differ significantly in tone and detail, revealing the psychological fractures the experience created among the survivors. Bancroft's journal entry from March 27th, written hours after reaching the surface, attempts to maintain scientific objectivity even in the face of catastrophe, made the decision to evacuate while T.W.'s condition drew the entity's attention. Pragmatic choice could not save all, chose to save the majority. Standard crisis protocol. But his handwriting, previously meticulous, had become erratic, with several words crossed out and rewritten. The page is also stained with what analysis has confirmed is blood Bancroft had bitten through his own lip while writing, possibly without noticing. Mansa's testimony to Egyptian authorities, given on March 28th and recorded by a clerk at the Cairo police headquarters, is more explicit about what they heard during their flight. Mr. Whitmore was still alive when we left him. He was calling out to us, calling our names, begging us not to leave. Dr. Bancroft said we had no choice, that Whitmore's heart was already condemned, that the creature... Here the clerk's notes indicate Mansa stopped speaking for several minutes. When he continued, his statement became more technical, describing the sounds they heard echoing through the passages. First the screaming, then a sound like when you bite into fruit, wet, breaking, and then nothing. Not silence, that word is insufficient. It was as though the space where sound had been was removed entirely, erased. Crawford's letter to his sister, dated April 2nd and written from a hotel in Cairo, is the most emotionally raw of the three accounts. Dear Margaret, I am not the man you knew. I don't think I can ever be that man again. We left Thomas to die. Worse than die to be unmade. Dr. Bancroft called it a tactical decision, but I saw his face when we ran. He knew what we were doing. We all knew, and we did it anyway. I close my eyes and I still hear Thomas calling my name. Crawford, please, don't leave me here. I don't want to stop existing. Those were his exact words, Margaret. Not I don't want to die, but I don't want to stop existing. He understood what was about to happen to him. The Egyptians have a concept called the second death annihilation beyond death, complete erasure from existence. Thomas got the second death while he was still alive. The Egyptian authorities' response was swift and coordinated in a way that suggested they had protocols in place for exactly this type of situation. Hassan Ahmed's testimony, given separately from the European survivors, included references to old standing orders dating back to Ottoman times instructions on how to handle breaches of ancient seals, how to contain what should not be released. Within 18 hours of the expedition's emergence, engineering crews were on site with cement mixers. By March 29th, the entrance was sealed with 3 feet of reinforced concrete. Steel bars were driven into the rock face. Warning signs in Arabic, English, and French were posted declaring the site structurally compromised and deadly. But the most telling detail comes from Hassan's testimony. Before we sealed it, I went back down, just to the outer chamber, not far. I wanted to see if any of the protective seals could be restored, and I heard it down there, still moving, still breathing. And I heard something else, voices, many voices, all reciting the same thing: I have not done evil, I have not stolen, I have not killed. The negative confession, over and over. The voices of everyone the Devourer has consumed across 3,000 years, still trying to prove their innocence, still being judged, still failing, forever. The British Museum received Bancroft's preliminary report on April 15th. The report made no mention of Whitmore's actual fate, no reference to the creature, no description of the Chamber of Scales. It simply noted that promising architectural features had been discovered, but that structural instabilities made further excavation inadvisable. The museum filed the report and quietly cancelled Bancroft's funding for future expeditions. Dr. Edward Bancroft never returned to Egypt. He died in 1089, 7 years after the expedition, from what his physician called progressive cardiac weakness, his heart simply growing weaker year by year until it could no longer sustain life. In his final delirium, witnesses reported he kept insisting that his heart was too heavy, that he was sorry, that he would confess everything if only the scales would balance. His last words were allegedly in a language none of the attending family members recognized. A Coptic scholar later identified them as Old Egyptian. "I have caused suffering. My heart testifies against me." The scales, it seemed, had finally tipped.